Right, I guess we're ready to begin. Thanks for Penn for sponsoring this event on the life and work of Vasily Grossman. Thank you all for coming. I am Edwin Frank, and I am the editor of the New York Review Books Classics series, in which I think now 4 of Grossman's books are published. And I'd like to begin in the usual way by introducing the panelists, and then will say a few words myself just to sort of sketch in the background of Grossman's life and career before directing some specific questions to each of the panelists, and then there'll be some talk, and then you can ask questions, and then we'll be done. So to introduce the panelists, immediately to my right is Martin Amis, who needs very little introduction indeed, I think, one of the finest and most celebrated novelists in English, most recently the author of Lionel Asbo's State of England, and also for our purposes today, the author of Koba the Dread, a rumination on Stalin and Stalinism and totalitarianism. To his right is Agata Tushinska, from Warsaw, a poet, a biographer of Isaac Bashevis Singer, among others, a memoirist, a novelist, whose most recent book in English translation is The Accused, Vera Gran, about a Polish-Jewish singer who was in the Warsaw Ghetto and who survived the war and then was accused of collaboration. And then Agata, I think, reconstructs her story, having gotten in touch with her many years later. I believe that's right. And finally, farthest to my right is Jochen Helbeck, a historian at Rutgers, an author of a very, very fine book about the Stalinist 30s called Revolution in My Mind, and whose book, the Stalingrad Protokolle, that's what it's called in German. It will be coming out in English, the Stalingrad Protocols. I don't know if it have the same title exactly, but consists of interviews that were done immediately after the Battle of Stalingrad with various Soviet soldiers to begin a kind of documentary history of the battle, of the fighting, of how people lived through it, because it's not just soldiers, I believe. And then these documents were sort of stashed away in the archives because there was no longer any need for Stalin to release what normal people thought about Stalingrad. Please welcome them. So, as I said, we'll be talking about the life and work of Vasily Grossman, a Soviet writer who lived through some of the most, to be a bit euphemistic, challenging years of the last century, and whose work is, among other things, a major active witness of those years. Courage is the theme of the festival, and Grossman was certainly a man of great courage. However, he was also acquainted with all the reasons that people have and for being cowardly, too, of which there are many, of course. A few words about Grossman's life. He was born in 1905 in Berdichev, where Joseph Conrad was also born and where Balzac died. Berdichev was a town in the Ukraine, is a town in the Ukraine. I assume it still has the same name, though the name may have changed over the years, I suppose, with a largely Jewish population. Grossman came from a family of assimilated Jews. The father was a scientist. His mother tutored in French for a while. The parents were separated, and he was brought up by his mother, even spent some years in Switzerland before returning to Russia, where he studied chemistry at Moscow State University. So like his father, he began as a scientist, and science will be one of the major characters, in fact, the major character in Life and Fate. His magnum opus is, in fact, a scientist. The father was very much a man of the left, a Menshevik, participant in the 1905 revolution, and as Grossman was later to say in a letter to Yezhov, not writing Yezhov is a complicated proposal, but he said, "All that I possess, my education, my success as a writer, the high privilege of sharing my thoughts and feelings with Soviet readers, I owe to the Soviet government." In many senses, that was true. He was a product of Soviet education and the Soviet world. And as Grossman's very fine translator, Robert Chandler, has remarked, part of the interest of what Grossman has to say is that unlike somebody like Nadezhda Mandelstam, he was a Soviet insider, at least for a while. Grossman began to publish stories in the early 30s. He caught the eye of Gorky, Babel, Bulgakov, He wrote a kind of socialist realist novel called about the Donbass miners. He had worked in the Donbass amongst miners. That, even though that would seems now a fairly stodgy kind of product of communist prolet cult, it was criticized at the time by Gorky as being a little too, I think the code word was naturalistic. His second novel was nominated for the Stalin Prize, but was then actually shot down by Stalin. But he stayed out of trouble for the most part in the 1930s, though his wife was at a certain point arrested, and that in fact was why he was writing Yezhov, who was the head of the Secret Service, was to actually get his wife freed, as he in fact succeeded in doing. At the beginning of the war, Grossman became a major war correspondent for Red Star, the Red Army paper, and reported from all the major battlefronts. But he was particularly famous for his reports from Stalingrad, which of course was in some sense the major battlefront. Though a rather short-sighted and pudgy man who was already walking with a cane before the war began, he was reputed to be quite fearless. During the war, his mother, who was still in Berdichev, was rounded up and shot by the Nazis. At the end of the war, Grossman collaborated with Ilya Ehrenberg on putting together the Black Book of Jewry, which was to document killings of Jews in Russia and Poland. They worked on the book for 3 or 4 years, but by the time it was ready to be published, it was deemed unpublishable. You were already beginning to see the anti-Semitic turn that took place after the war, as Stalin pushed first to make the war a war of all nations, all Soviet nations against the Nazis, and to minimize the fact that the Jews had been the particular victims of the Nazis. Grossman also wrote a novel, initially to be called Stalingrad, based on his experience as a reporter in Stalingrad. This novel was published after a great deal of difficulty and after many revisions and being sent back and forth to the Writers' Union and the censors, I suppose is more to the point, under the title For a Just Cause. Originally, Grossman had wanted to call it Stalingrad, but as Mikhail Sholokhov, a great novelist but an apparatchik, is reported to have said, well, we can't have a Jew writing about our great war, so that's impossible. So it was given this more pro forma title. It was published in '52, just before the outbreak of the Doctor's Plot, or just around the time of the outbreak of the Doctor's Plot. I may be getting my chronology wrong. At the time of the outbreak of the Doctor's Plot, Grossman was asked to sign a letter against the killer doctors, and did in fact go ahead and sign such a letter, something which happens again in Life and Fate to his alter ego, who signs a letter denouncing other members of his academic department. The book came out in '52 for a just cause, and was immediately attacked from the major papers, and there was a crescendo of attacks, which continued over several months, and almost certainly Grossman would have been arrested as part of the ongoing anti-Semitic actions, except Stalin died. He was called Lucky Grossman, and this was perhaps his biggest piece of luck. The book then was published, became quite successful, but as a consequence of what had gone on, and consequence partly of his guilt, I think, for signing the letter, he began to write Life and Fate, which continued the story of the same characters who were introduced in For a Just Cause. If anybody's read Life and Fate and wondered, where do these characters come from? Because you're there amongst them. They're all introduced in the other book. Finished Life and Fate by 1960, and then in fairly remarkable Life and Fate minces no words in attacking Stalin and attacking the larger Bolshevik project. Well, it may be a little more nuanced about that. He took Life and Fate to one of the major Soviet literary journals and presented it for publication. The book was, as he liked to say, arrested. He was not. The book was. It was arrested, everything, his entire apartment was ransacked, everything that could conceivably have anything to do with the book, down to the typewriter ribbon, was confiscated. His backyard was or a backyard of his son, or I can't forget who, a relative, was dug up entirely. 2 copies of the magazine, of the novel, had been hidden away, and they remained hidden. They were surprisingly not discovered. So the KGB arrested the book. Interestingly, though, the response on high begins to suggest the oddities of Khrushchev's thaw. I think we said in the copy, the slushy uncertainties of Khrushchev's thaw. That somebody in Khrushchev's office said, you know, this is a good book, and we're considering publishing it. Eventually, Suslov, who was the ideological chief, summoned Grossman and explained that the book could not be published for 200 or 300 years, but nonetheless did foresee publication. Grossman was very unhappy and dejected and bitter about the arrest of Life and Fate. He seems to have thought he seems to have thought that there was a good chance the book would be published, which is interesting given how openly critical it is of the Soviet status quo. He then turned to interviewing camp survivors, and which he would do. They would be ushered in secretly to his small apartment where he would interview them. And for his last book, a short novel called Everything Flows, which is as much essay as novel, but which begins with a man coming back from the camps to confront, I believe it's his relatives, who led a life of relative privilege and were part of the, were not outcasts, much less prisoners. He continued, however, even though his book had been arrested, he continued to publish short stories. He was still a member of the Writers' Union. He was sent on a junket to Armenia, but he grew sicker and died at the age of, I believe, 59 in 1964. Somebody who knew him describes waking him up late in life accidentally, and Grossman startling awake and saying, "They took me off for interrogation. I didn't betray anyone, did I?" A few last words about The Fate of Life and Fate and its reception. The book was not published until 1980. It was published by a house in Zurich, L'Age d'Homme. Shortly thereafter, it was translated into English. Its fate in English is really what I can speak to most. It was published very much in America as a piece of dissident lit, and I remember not reading it when it came out on the grounds that it was sort of been there, heard that, and it couldn't be, it didn't seem like it was going to be an interesting novel. It seemed like it was just going to be a document that was, this was around 1984, a document that at some point was serving the interests of Reaganism, it would have been, it seemed to me at that point. It went out of print in America immediately in 1989. It interestingly has remained in print in England, and I think that has a lot to do with the fact that the English are much more aware that Stalingrad was a turning point of the war, if not the turning point of the war, whereas America tends to entertain itself with its stories of the greatest generation. In the meantime, in the last 20 years or so, the book has gotten an ever bigger audience in Spain. It's a huge seller. I think in Poland actually it's had quite a reception, and I think it's seen less and less in the prejudiced way I saw it as a purely political work, but as a remarkable work of literature, which is true of Everything Flows as well. These are fictions that deal with some of the most appalling facts of the last century, and in fact of recorded history, but they do so with an extraordinary humanity, with a great eye for human existence. Robert Chandler, the translator who I keep mentioning, has called Life and Fate a Chekhovian epic. And they also, I think, manifest a good deal of striking formal invention, which is all the more surprising given that in some ways they are still products of a certain kind of socialist realist aesthetic, but maybe it's sort of the transcendental form of socialist realism in which the socialism gives way to the realism. With that said, I will turn to our panelists, and I thought I'd first ask Jochen Helbeck about Grossman's experience in Stalingrad. It was a turning point in his life. It gave him, in some sense, his cause. And so I thought, Jochen, you might tell us about that, and also tell us a little bit about For a Just Cause, the novel that introduces the characters in Life and Fate.
Well, thank you, Edwin. So Vasily Grossman was a wartime correspondent for the Red Star in Stalingrad. He was, in fact, the longest-serving wartime correspondent in Stalingrad, covering the battle from September through December. And in fact, he was on the right bank, on the western side of the Volga, in the burning, and fought over a city, which of course was a very deadly mission for a prolonged period. So that was an act of courage. He was mesmerized, I think, by this spirit of the war, and I think for me as a historian, it also became this starting quest to understand this spirit of the Red Army soldier in Stalingrad, what motivated them to fight. And so he clearly, if you read his wartime diary, which is a piece of literature distinct from Life and Fate that originated 15 years after the war, so you have to really keep these, sorry, not 15, but 10 years after the war, you have to keep these two pieces of writings distinct. He is mindful of the incredible coercion that was in place, the Order 227 by Stalin, not one step back, that anyone who would turn back would be shot, blocking detachments behind the front lines that would kill deserters or threaten to kill them. So he does mention these activities, but still he's in search of what in fact is motivating these soldiers. And there's a real Tolstoyan search for this spirit of the Russian soldier, or perhaps the Russian/Soviet soldier, which I find deeply fascinating. As part of my own historical work, I actually interviewed some of the veterans of the 62nd Army in Moscow, and one of them remembers meeting Grossman. He was a staff officer in Vasily Chuykov's 62nd Army, and he met Grossman at the landing point and brought him to the headquarters, to the command bunker. And so, me being infatuated with the big writer, asked him, so how did he look? And he just shrugged and said, no, Truthteller, a scarecrow. And he was not impressed with how this lieutenant colonel's uniform hung on Grossman. He was walking with a cane, short-sighted, with glasses. And so maybe there's also a shade of anti-Semitism. I didn't ask him about that, but the Russian then lieutenant, now a retired general, was not that impressed with Grossman. But the historians that Edwin mentioned initially, who came to Stalingrad to interview the soldiers, they in fact sort of tripped over Grossman. Grossman had left Stalingrad, and they in part interviewed the same soldiers. So Grossman did a big piece for Red Star on the soldiers of the 308th Division, the Siberian Division, and it's a remarkable wartime essay. It's called The Line of the Main Drive. It's still waiting to be published in good English. It does exist in some not really good translation that was done many years ago. And this is sort of a central piece in which he tries to understand what motivates these soldiers, so really, in a way, on their death mission. And some of the words from this essay are preserved in a very unlikely place if you think about Grossman's subsequent fate and how he died really estranged from the Soviet state. And in fact, you'll find these words in the Mamayev Kurgan monument, this huge Stalinist structure that was set up, the war memorial that was finally opened in 1967 after multiple delays, but it was planned in the 50s, so it's grandiose, very Stalin-era Soviet style. And among those many commemorative places in this overall monument, you'll find a basin, and next to it there's a wall, and then inscribed on the walls are words from Grossman's essay on The Line of the Main Drive, and it says something like, an iron wind was beating in their faces, but they kept marching on. And a superstitious fear gripped the opponent. Were these people human? Were they mortal? And then you walk on and you come into the Pantheon, which is a rotunda with a flame, an eternal flame coming out of the ground, and then and the walls, circular walls around, are inscribed the names of 7,000 apparently randomly picked Red Army soldiers who died there. And on top there's a relief, and you'll see the continuation, the answer to this question. Grossman conceived it very simple. Yes, we were human, and we were human and we died, but we did what we had to do. And of course, it's not entirely Grossman there. It's more like, yes, they were humans, but they died for the cause of the Soviet motherland or something like that. So it's a little rendered more pathetically, but still it is Grossman, but no one will tell you that it is actually Grossman's voice. So Grossman is actually quite present in Soviet Russia and in Russia today. He himself, I think, remained fixated on Stalingrad. I think that's fair to say. Edwin mentioned this novel that he originally wanted to call Stalingrad and changed it to For a Just Cause, which are lines from Molotov's speech of June 22nd, we're fighting for a just cause. And he himself did 6 versions, which are all in his archive in Moscow, and then he was finally happy with the 6th version, sent it in, and then it went through several more versions, I think 5 more, and it took so long time that Grossman started keeping a diary recording the travails of his manuscript. That diary is also preserved in the archive. And it's, I think, a wonderful novel. Of course, it is different in tone from Life and Fate. It does reflect the times when it was written. It reflects the censorship. It reflects Grossman's obligatory salutes to the party and to Stalin. But nonetheless, these actors are already conceived at the time, and there is a clear, distinct, recognizable line that links them. And in fact, when you read them, you will, when you read both parts, you will recognize that this is a true Tolstoyan epic and in the tradition of War and Peace. And so I think one thing you didn't mention is that New York Review of Books Classics is preparing an English translation of For a Just Cause, which I think is fantastic.
We are, yeah, though we'll publish it as Stalingrad, going back to the original title. In Life and Fate, one of the things that Grossman writes about Victor Strum, his sort of alter ego, is that he says, never before the war had Strum thought of himself as a Jew, of his mother as a Jew. The other quite extraordinary thing that Grossman wrote after the war is The Hell of Treblinka, because he was one of the first people to come to Treblinka, and he worked through, you know, the Germans had tried to bury Treblinka and hide it, and he worked through and did a lot of legwork to work out what had gone on, and wrote in this 30 or 40-page essay an exhaustive account of what he imagined the well, and in many ways was quite correct, the operations of the camp were. Agata, I was going to ask you to talk about you know, Grossman's growing sense of himself as a Jew, and the way in which that changed his attitude, perhaps to Stalin and to his own work.
Well, I'm not a historian, I'm just a writer. So I want to tell you how I read Vasily Grossman. And I have to admit that he wasn't one of my favorite writers. I learned Russian at school, and I really liked those lessons because I loved Anton Chekhov. For me, he was like the greatest Russian writer for many, many years, as well as Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Bulgakov. But Grossman wasn't known in Poland when I was at school and then later on, so he wasn't my number one. But, well, finally I realized that we're very close, and I want to tell you why. It will be a kind of a confession to you. So reading is looking for mirrors, just like writing. We choose authors whose experience is familiar to us, often intuitively. The two masterpieces of Polish Holocaust narrative were on my nightstand for years. Medallions by Zofia Naukowska, Medaliony, and This Way to the Guess, Ladies and Gentlemen, Proszę Państwa do gazu, by Tadeusz Borowski. The war has been written in my fate before I found out why, but maybe it touches anyone who was born on Polish soil. Before my mother revealed the family secret of her Jewish origin, Unconsciously, I have been absorbing the experience of the Shoah. I was constantly aware that it was only by chance that I was not directly affected by it. The Treblinka death camp was also built for me. It turned out to be the destination of the family I never knew. It was Vasily Grossman who wrote the first report from Treblinka. It was used as evidence as Nuremberg. He described all circles of the Treblinka hell, each step of the carefully organized death machine, a black theater of illusions. He did not omit the band playing music at the station, the sorting of looted valuables, collecting hair, the smell of burned bodies permeated by the odor of slaked lime, the Germans torturing with lies, overpowering with fear. Figures of sophisticated murderers still continue to provoke terror. Children's heads are smashed. Dogs are trained to pull out men's genitals. Concrete chambers to suffocate the innocent. At the end of 1943, Grossman and Ilya Ehrenburg began work on a black book dedicated to the mass murder of Jews during the World War II. They were looking for witnesses, collecting the memory of survivors, and working on their stories. Grossman said in 1946 that the collected materials will serve as an indictment of the German fascists. That's why I took up this difficult and anguishing task, he said. The book recounts the death of approximately 5 million people. At the end of 1948, the Black Book was withdrawn from print. The material scattered in a Jewish publication house, Der Emes. Much of the material for the Black Book is preserved. It was later published in Israel and the Soviet Union. The Black Book includes a record of the Shoah of the Jews in Berdichev, written by Grossman himself. On September 15, 1941, his mother, Yekaterina Savilyevna, the person dearest to him, along with thousands of other Jews, was shot by the Nazis. Grossman knew about his background, but he fully experienced the essence of his identity only after the extermination, when confronted with Hitler's actions and Russia's attitude toward this tragedy. Then he started to compare two totalitarian regimes. Few before him dared to do anything like that. It shocked the intellectual left to regard totalitarian regimes as equivalent, the Soviets and the Nazis. Grossman also did not hesitate to propose the thesis that anti-Semitism was one of the driving ideological forces, not only for Nazism, but also for communism. I did not concern myself with Russian totalitarianism for many years. My own Polish seemed to be bearable. In time, I immersed myself in the wartime past. It engulfed me for a long time. For years, I have been pacing over constantly replenished maps of Jewish suffering. That's why I believe I was far away from Grossman. He was not known in communist Poland. and I knew nothing about his Jewish mother. This part of his fate is close to me. I identify with it, with Jews locked in ghettos and sentenced to death by Germans, with those who miraculously survive the experience of post-war anti-Semitism in Stalin's Russia. A Polish version of that was available in my family. The mother figure whom he summons into life and faith, making her the narrator and observer of the last days of the Berdychów ghetto, she fictionally writes an imaginary letter to him, her beloved son. She continues to speak to him long after her death for the rest of his life. He dedicated his writing to her. Paradoxically, he drew strength from the great absent present. He appointed her as his guardian angel. Through a story, he brought her back for himself and for others. He brought her from love, longing, and the guilt that he did not share the end with her. He paid tribute to her. He erected a monument. The strength of his prose has just such power. For Grossman, writing was a salvation and necessity, giving testimony, the hardest, the most painful, in his rendition, was a supreme act of courage. I'll stop here and then.
Okay. Martin, the connection between Stalinism and Nazism, the common totalitarianism, is something that you've thought about a good deal, and so.
Yeah, well, in Life and Fate, in those great scenes of interrogation and argument, he assigns rough parity to the two totalitarianisms. Which was worse, the big moustache or the little moustache? There is one of Stalin's crimes, I think, can be compared quite closely to the Holocaust. And this was the terror famine in the Ukraine, 1933, and is the subject of the other novel of Grossman's that we've been mentioning, originally called Forever Flowing, retranslated very well and called Everything Flows. And it's the best description we have of that terror famine, a deliberate state-organized famine that killed probably, the numbers are wildly disputed, but I think a minimum of 7 million in the Volga and in the Ukraine. And you've got to think, as he does and describes, what it's like to watch your family starve and your children starve. And he says that in some households, parents screamed when they saw their children. And the children cried all day, at first cried all day for food, and then cried all night as well. Now imagine that. Imagine your children crying 24 hours a day for food. He said some ran away from their children. And he said, yet in others, love never died in that family. And the mother, who barely had strength to lift her arms, her empty hands, would gather the children around and tell them stories. And he said it was noticeable that in families where love had gone, they died quicker. But he said, but love saved no one. And the huge death tolls in the cities, 120,000 in Kharkov. And the people crawling around at sort of your ankle height begging for food. And even the people who didn't die were forming howling queues in front of the black market outlets run by the government. And there were huge warehouses where they took mostly children that they found in the street and just left them to die, or took them 10 miles out of town by train and left them there, abandoned them there. I think that sort of measures up to the Holocaust. But I would say in Conquest's great book about the terror famine, The Harvest of Sorrow, he begins by saying, to get some measure of what we face here, it has to be realized that 20 people lost their lives, not for every word, but for every letter in this book. The book is 404 pages long. And that means that little inoffensive adjectives prepositions like at and to represent the deaths of 8 or 9 large families. So a sort of degree of turpitude is matched by Stalin, and also, had he lived a bit longer, there would have been a second Holocaust for the Jews in Eurasia. According to Solzhenitsyn, it was all due, those doctors, the doctors' plot, those doctors were going to be hanged on Red Square, and there was whipping up huge anti-Semitic wave of public opinion, hysterical propaganda against the Jews. And then they were going to have to run the gauntlet all the way to the Chinese border, where barracks had been prepared for them. And there were, I think, 2.5 million Russian Jews at that time, maybe 3. And they too would have been obliterated. So it looks as though Stalin is at least on a par with Hitler, but I don't think he is, and I think he's worse. And Conquest was asked this himself on television. He just said, "I feel so." But I think you can sort of explain it a little bit, why Hitler was so much worse. The main point being that that Stalin was able to do his worst. He was given the natural span to apply himself. He died aged 74, just in time to save the Russian Jews. The whole anti-Jewish drive stopped dead when he died. And imagine a Hitler who'd lived another 20 years. For that, he would, of course, have had to win the war. But imagine what Hitler would have done in another 20 years. Also, you can sort of make a rationale for what Stalin did. Even the Gulag, you can't make one for the Great Terror of 1937-38, with well over 1 million executions. That was to stay in power. Terror is always an expression of insecurity from a dictator, everywhere and always. It's a confession of lack of legitimacy and insecurity. But you can, it's been done. You can say, the Gulag, for instance, you can say, well, it's sort of economic necessity, that they didn't realize that the Gulag was going to lose money. And when the average prisoner arrived in the Gulag, he would always say, why doesn't anyone tell Comrade Stalin that this is going on? But actually what no one told Comrade Stalin, because they didn't dare, was that the Gulag lost money. It was there to make money, and it lost money. Whereas with Hitler, there was no necessity for the Holocaust. If you want to get an idea of what happened in Nazi Germany, you go to your thesaurus, look up the word bad, copy out all the synonyms, then go to the word base, etc. Then go to the word ridiculous, copy out all those synonyms, and then go to the word stupid and copy out all of those. There was no rationale. It was an insanity. And then what seemed to happen was that when you start saying that vices are virtues, like fanaticism, mercilessness, then there's a sort of complete capsizal, and you win merit by being worse than your peers. And that seems to have happened in Germany, and it's peculiarly German only in this, that the Germans, having decided to explore evil, were their usual very efficient and thorough selves. Thank you.
I want to go back, and this just, we can talk about it as each or any of you feels, in response to both these things, to the fact that Grossman did take the book to be published, and I suppose that raises the question of whether he retained, after all of his own experiences, some sort of faith in the revolutionary project, or perhaps not the revolutionary project, but in the Soviet establishment. That seems even perhaps more difficult to imagine. But there's a way in which, when one reads Life and Fate, it depicts Stalingrad as two battles. One is a battle of of the Soviet Union, because in fact it's specifically not depicted as a merely Russian endeavor against the Germans, but also, and I think I would assume this is one of the ways in which it's different from For a Just Cause, the Battle of Stalingrad becomes a symbolic battle of the Soviet people against Stalin. They, in this battle, show the will and the resolve and the solidarity, at least the people, for example, there are a group of people at an outpost exposed to the main German front who have an almost, well, there's an old Bolshevik who comes and thinks he's coming back almost to join the French Commune again, only they reject him because they're not interested in the Bolsheviks anymore. But they are in complete solidarity, and solidarity unto death in defeating the Germans. So then the question becomes whether at some level Grossman did go on believing that there was, that this battle against Stalinism could effectively be waged in the Soviet Union and could be won, or some hope therefore.
Well, I would agree with that. I think there is a sense in Grossman's writing throughout, I mean, or indeed in his life. And Grossman was a complex person, and so he did discover his Jewishness, but he never shed his Russianness. He was a Russian writer, he was a Soviet writer, and he was a Jew. And so his daughter records that in the evenings when they met, he would play recordings from the war, and then inevitably the Holy War, I mean a really very moving, powerful song would be playing, and Grossman would get up, stooped, and march to this song and sing along in his very unmelodic voice. And so he was beholden to this myth of the war, of the heroism of Red Army soldiers, in spite of his mounting critique against the Stalinist state. And I think his criticism really focused on Stalin and the state that he represented, more so than on a sort of abiding sort of intellectual principle that you could call Stalinism. And in fact, there's a very interesting misreading on Grossman's part of the nature of the standoff between these two regimes, which is the central scene of Life and Fate, which is the standoff between this old prisoner who's in a concentration camp, in a death camp, Mostovskoy, and the Gestapo chief, Liss. And then Liss very skillfully kind of provokes him to admit that, yes, the revolution has sold out, and that the revolutionary ideals will inevitably kind of slide into Stalinism, and that Stalinism is in fact worse because it is built on this false idealism, and it exploits this false idealism. And so he says, in the end, we are both children of the 20th century, admit it, and we can just trade shirts. We are the same, of the same kind. And after, a prolonged discussion, Mostovskoy is about to sort of cede this point. This is a really interesting scene. It's a purely Soviet imagination at work, because if you imagine a concentration camp, granted, Mostovskoy is not Jewish, he's Russian, but for the Germans, the Nazis, they made not that much of a distinction between Jews and Russians in that regard. In the concentration camp, a Russian communist was on the same par as a Jew. They were all part of this Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy in their imagination. And so they didn't bother to interview Jews. They looked at them, they sized them up, and then they killed them. So a physiognomical reading basically taking a photograph is all you need. You don't engage in discussions with them. And so that's the big Soviet misunderstanding of the conflict between these two systems, that in fact intellectual, philosophical discussion will resolve things. That's not the case. There were two very different regimes, and Martin is completely right that there are a lot baser and non-intellectual motives at work. There was a rationale, I think. It was racist to the core. It was Germany above all. It was exploitation for a greater Germany. It had a certain consistency, but it did not work through the principles of the Enlightenment. And whatever you can say about Stalin, there is a principle about having these discussions that can sometimes end in a murderous vein, but nonetheless, this is something that I think Grossman never gave up. And I think he never gave up also the hope that Stalingrad engendered something better. In fact, in the Treblinka essay that Agata so movingly talked about, there are three references to Stalingrad, which I think are hugely important. He says initially in 1942, the whole world has quieted down, London is silent, New York is silent, no one is listening to the suffering of the Jews. There's only a distant thunder at the Volga, and he's referring to the Battle of Stalingrad. Then he says in March or April 43, that's just after the battle, Himmler comes to Treblinka to dissolve the camp. Why is he coming? Because the battle has been decided. So Stalingrad is in a causal relationship to the shutting down of Treblinka. And then finally, many pages later, he talks, and it's not accidental, he talks about the Soviet soldiers with their medals for the defense of Stalingrad, recording the survivors, or in fact, the collaborators who they found, and taking testimony of the collaborators. So it's very clear that the Stalingraders made this possible, and they freed Russia, but they also terminated the Nazi business. And so this is something that Grossman, to the end of his day, I think never parted with.
Mm-hmm.
Never?
Never parted with.
Parted with.
So there's sort of an ongoing sense of the possibility of heroism, even if only by virtue of hypocrisy, in some sense. There's the Soviet regime at least pays lip service to a certain virtue, and therefore, at some level, has to, at some level, can be held accountable to what it doesn't do because it says what it says it should be doing. And that there's also, another theme that is central to the work, and I think central to the experience of his generation, is the theme of collaboration, of coercion, of more coercion than collaboration in Grossman. And so I wondered if there was any thoughts about that as it's talked about in the book. And
wouldn't you say, though, that what made the Russian soldiers fight was, it looked early on in the war, in 1941, up until November, it looked as if had the German troops and the Einsatzgruppen behaved humanely in Russia, they would have had the support of the population. And there were Vlasov and etc. who fought for the Germans, but their methods were so Vernichtungskrieg, exterminatory war. And then it turns into a story of the home advantage, that the Russian troops were fighting for their homeland, the Great Patriotic War. And when they eventually overran Germany, there's a great moment, I'm not sure if it's in Life and Fate, when just after von Paulus has surrendered to Zhukov, they look out over Stalingrad, and there's nothing left higher than your knee. And Zhukov, I think it's Zhukov, says, one day Berlin will look like this. But when they were overrunning Germany, they couldn't believe how sort of beautiful and luxurious it all was. And they're thinking, why'd they come to our place when they've got this? But then it became, just heroic madness from the Russians that, and the German generals' correspondence as they think they're going to take Moscow in 41, Christmas 41. They're saying, the Russians suddenly very fierce resistance. And also they have these lovely warm jackets. One of the great inanities of Barbarossa, the German campaign, was he thought he could invade Russia. A ridiculous notion. What are you going to do? Occupy Siberia, which is 8 times the size of Europe. What are you going to do? You're going to have a boiling insurgency right down the length of the Urals till the end of time. But Hitler thought he could do it without antifreeze. And my view is that the Wehrmacht, the German army, would have revolted and not agreed to this idea of invading Russia had it not been for France. Hitler, they thought the invasion of France was crazy, and yet they did it in 35 days. And then after that, you weren't going to get any more resistance from the German army. And so this fundamentally, essentially insane project was launched. And then you have the extended supply lines, which of course the Russians didn't have. And you could have done it on the back of an envelope that they were going to lose.
Well, that partly speaks to Jochen's point about assuming the enemy is just so fundamentally stupid and inhuman that, in fact, you don't have to make any realistic assessment of them because they'll fold or give in.
Well, it was amazing how well they fought and went on fighting. Sebastian Haffner wrote two very interesting books about Hitler, where he said, the Battle of the Bulge, that last offensive from Germany, was not against the Russians, but against the Allies on the Western Front. And that was because by then, Sebastian Haffner says, the people Hitler hated most were the Germans. So he wanted them to fall not to he wanted to keep the Americans and the British out so that they'd suffer the Russians. An army of rapists, as it was called. And who was that Republican moron who said that when women are raped, their reproductive system shuts down? Well, it may interest him to know that there were 1 million births from the rapes committed by the Red Army. But Hitler wanted that. He wanted. I know exactly the moment when he turned against the German people. It's when he had a sort of march past. I can't actually find it when it was. I think perhaps before Poland. And 200 people showed up. And looked not at all enthusiastic. And Hitler stood out on the balcony and cursed the German people for not having the appetite for this great venture. And I'm sure he thought, he said in his last will, if we prove to be the weaker race, then I'll shed no tears for the Germans, he said. They just weren't strong enough.
No, absolutely. In 45, Goebbels was producing a photo album for Hitler's use, which reverses this whole, and actually continues this whole visual sizing up of the enemy. This time it was a photograph album of the Russian commanders, and Goebbels was looking at them and saying, yes, they are truly the better opponent. They're a younger, fitter race, but it's the same mode of looking at the enemy and sizing them up and coming to a conclusion. So it's just it's still true to the German laws of racial degeneration, but now it applied to the Germans as the...
Well, except that there were 160 million Russians and 75 million Germans.
That too, yeah.
Yeah. And when America... His armaments minister, Sauckel, and Fritz Tudd told Hitler in November 41, before the Russian counteroffensive, when they got the troops from Siberia over and suddenly they had 20 more divisions, they told him he couldn't win in November, before Pearl Harbor, before the Americans came in. He just didn't have the economy, he didn't have the numbers.
Yeah, but perhaps to return to Edwin's point about you ask about collaboration and cowardice and such things. I think to me Grossman really reads on that line as a Soviet writer who is shaped very much by Soviet wartime moral code that in its flattest form or in its simplest form just distinguishes between two modes you can be. You can be either a hero or you can be a coward. There's nothing in between. And I think to Grossman's credit, his works show the many shades in between, but nevertheless, I think he does adhere to this code. There is clearly a vector toward heroism, and there's also a vector toward failure. And both of them are strongly autobiographical and somehow bring out or bring in the writer's own experience. So when Strum, the physician, when he caves in and writes this letter, it speaks to Grossman's own experience. But there are also other moments that suggest how Grossman would have liked to see himself. There's in the story on Berdichev, in the Black Book, it concludes with, and Grossman himself came to Berdichev with the Red Army and went to see what happened to his mother. Only in January 1944 did he find out that she had been killed and how she had been killed, because they were survivors. And so in a very impersonal form, he records what happened in Berdichev, collecting all the testimony, so impersonal when it comes to him, collecting the testimony of others. And he concludes this story with a clip from a newspaper that talks about a Jewish Red Army soldier who comes to Berdichev and finds out that his mother has been killed and goes on killing Germans and is then killed in battle. And so that perhaps too is a projection of how Grossman would have liked to see himself. There's inevitably this way how he sizes himself up according to very distinctly, I would say, Soviet values. And that makes it also so interesting for a historian to study his texts.
Well, it's also true that as you go along through his different books, especially Life and Fate and then Everything Flows, that a certain kind of monolithicness which marked Soviet writing at its dullest breaks up and becomes sort of dialogic. So that in something like Everything Flows, you have the Zek coming back to meet his relatives who've lived, a prosperous life. I think they're successful academics. Effectively, they live a perfectly recognizable middle-class, Western, cosmopolitan life. This is, however, understandably involved certain kinds of evasions, omissions. It's not. I don't think that it's particularly that they're presented as actually having done anything all that bad. They simply haven't confronted that all sorts of really bad things were going on all around, and they are certainly very, very awkward with their relative coming back from the camps. But you go in this book, I mean, you can have the heroic book, which is the heroic communist book. You have the heroic anti-communist book. What's rather interesting is that this book begins on an ambiguous, an ambivalent terrain, because you were allowed to see that the desire to lead a normal life, the normal life these people led, was not fundamentally, what was certainly deeply human and not deeply reprehensible, but at the same time, it was in some sense it was an evasion, and the other man's life is a standing reproach. Yet, in some sense, the rest of the book becomes a discussion of how he cannot be reintegrated, or his difficulty of being reintegrated into humanity, having suffered and been in the midst of an absolutely traumatized world. When you get to the terror famine, at the end of it, interestingly, the story is relayed through the eyes of the woman he's begun to see, and he's been completely alone. And in some sense, this is the beginning of a new human relationship. But she has as a burden on her, having been in this situation, and I believe actually as a party organizer who had gone down to, I think, in some sort of official capacity, not to starve people, but certainly not to starve them. So it's interesting how, in some sense, Grossman's work opens up in that way.
Well, we ought to concede that. It's a very Soviet book in that it's curious flatness sometimes, and it's sort of literalism. But there's no question, he is the Tolstoy of the USSR. And this is the War and Peace of the USSR.
Well, what was interesting also for me, it's the concept of collaboration with everyday's life. And I found in my latest book, I am talking about it as well. What does it mean? What do we do to survive? And in what circumstances we do certain things? And here in his book, Everything Flows, I found an incredibly accurate quotation for my book, and as well, I think it's very accurate, and I want to, maybe we can discuss it, because it's really, really important, I think. And the quotation goes like this. Why, it is like, this is a 7th chapter. It takes the form of a trial after an accidental meeting of one character with an informer. And it presents 4 different Judases and attempts to present the justification of each of them. And now the prosecutor says, why must you determine our guilt? Do you not see where the difficulty lies? Maybe we really are guilty, but there is no judge who has the moral right to discuss the question of our guilt. Remember how Lev Tolstoy said that no one in the world is guilty, but in our state, things are different. Everyone is guilty. There is not one innocent person anywhere. All that we can argue about is a degree of guilt. So is it for you, comrade prosecutor, to accuse us? Only the dead, only those who did not survive have the right to judge us. But the dead do not ask questions. The dead are silent. I think it's a wonderful paragraph that, you know.
Yeah.
Well, it's an endless story, both totalitarianisms of the way they sort of draw you into the web and compromise you and fill you with self-hatred, basically. And they have you, and you bring them down to your level. And it's one of the most horrible aspects of it all. And they make you a Jewish Pole in the ghetto would finding herself sewing swastikas onto German uniforms. I think, hang on, they killed my father, my mother, my 3 uncles, my 4 aunts, my cousins, and here I am furthering their war effort.
Well, I want to survive.
Why do they want to humiliate to such an extent?
I want to ask a question which is in some sense more, it has to do with the relationship of aesthetics to this kind of historical material. Life and Fate is a book. I'm just curious. Gorky early on said to Grossman, in criticizing something he'd written early on, what truth are you trying to tell? He said about the book. Write in the service of the truth you're trying to tell. In Gorky's case, this would have been a more or less dogmatic truth, or so it was presented.
Well, Gorky was hugely compromised.
But to a very large degree, Grossman continued to abide to the notion, and the things we're talking about, the ways in which we're discussing his work, to serve the notion that his work was revealing a truth. In this case, it became, as time went on, it became often an ugly truth, though there is an ongoing emphasis on humanity's capacities to endure. And one of the ways in which truth is incorporated into the books is by the use of documents or what you might call pseudo-documents. The letter you mentioned early on, the letter from the mother, that is a central part of early on in Life and Fate. There is also the letter from the kind of holy fool character who's in the camp named Ikonikov, who writes a letter about what we need are senseless acts of kindness senseless acts of kindness are the way in which humanity will endure. There's also the wonderful phrase that Ikonikov speaks to somebody in the camp, macaronic phrase, where he says, "What can I do, mio padre?" he says to a priest. I can't remember whatever the language is, we'll make it English for the point of view, but we are in uno Vernichtungslager, which is what he's sort of describing the 20th century as. But against this, he proposes these, in effect, senseless acts of kindness. So that's almost two questions I've packed there. One is about the use of documentation in art, and of art as documentation, and to what degree these things are compatible, or to what degree we see something like Grossman as finally a witness. The other, I suppose, is about art as edification. Both things that our established sense of art shies away from.
Well, in as much as they're fabricated, they're still, the documentary stuff is still artistic. I think that all literature is almost by definition hopeful. That line, no poetry after Auschwitz, nonsense. There was poetry during Auschwitz. Paul Celan, Black Milk of Dawn, we drink you at dusk. Great poetry being written, and Primo Levi. But I think Grossman did, I mean, his marvelous paragraphs on freedom, how life is freedom, and such insights as the end justifies the means. He says, no, means define ends. And, you know, at a time when the great historian, Marxist historian, Eric Hobsbawm, like many others, said that if 20 million died to achieve the earthly paradise, then it would have been worth it. No, it would not have been worth it for that reason, as Grossman says. But the book ends, Life and Fate and Everything Flows, end with an assertion of that there is this core of human goodness facing, you know, a cataract of evil, but it will always be there.
Yeah, there's actually, I think, also a redemptive moment at work. And Agatha gave this wonderful section from Everything Flows, this scene with the prosecutor. There is a continuation. It's not the end of the story, because Grossman believes you cannot give up. You have to continue to write, as long as you do what you must do, which is to remember the dead and to bring them back to life in writing. So that is one way you can redeem your own moral implication, and so this, I think, is something that clearly is at work. Documentarism is so much part of it, because there is documentary style, and in fact, for me as a historian, I'm struck by how truthful, not truthful, but how assiduously and how faithfully Grossman worked as a historian in Stalingrad. When you read his war diary, he has interviews with, say, Commander Chuikov, and I then found these protocols with the historians who interviewed the same soldiers, and there's a 40-page interview with Chuikov, and in one passage Chuikov talks about how you, as a commander, must show courage. You cannot cave in if someone sees you, because then your authority as a commander is diminished. And he even cites Lev Tolstoy, probably showing to Grossman how well read he is, as sort of supporting evidence for that. And in Grossman's war notebook, there's only one sentence. No one, full stop, has, full stop, ever, full stop, seen, full stop, me, full stop, weep, full stop. So Grossman was very impressed with that sentence, but it's the only sentence, and in this sentence he also says with a lot more flourish toward the historians. So he worked very well as a historian, yet it is also fallacious to simply read Life and Fate as if it was a record of that war, because Life and Fate is primarily a document of the Khrushchev period and a post-Stalin era work in which he reimagines this battle, repositions it, because from 1953 53 or 55 or 57. It looks very different from how it looked in 1943. So certain lines have closed. The hope is no longer there. The liberation, it was illusory. And so he's rewriting the record, but still abiding to this documentary method, which I think is one reason why Gorky had problems with Grossman, and that's one reason why so many wartime readers loved Grossman, because they could recognize themselves in his writings. And his writings were very, very influential. In fact, Soviet cinematography during the war was shaped by Grossman. They couldn't figure out how to film Stalingrad because it was so confusing. There was only, smoke, there was gunfire, but there was no choreography. And Grossman showed how to do it. So there's a filmmaker, Olyankin, and he, after reading a story by Grossman, came to a conclusion: I have to do it differently. I have to focus on one individual Red Army soldier and show how he works in battle. And that was Grossman's concern, to show how simple people work, what the kind of ethic is that animates simple people in extraordinary situations. Meanwhile, he still is very much Soviet in that he distinguishes between those who live up to the challenge of the war and those who fail. The War Diary always distinguished between women who are either heroic, ascetic, or those who search simple pleasures. That's at work, and that continues to be at work until the very end with that couple that invites the exec to dinner.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But also what he did, he mourned the victims. Mm-hmm. The victims of the Holocaust, of the Shoah, and also the victims of the famine in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. I have to say that after reading this text in Everything Flows, I'm a different person. I never ever read such a powerful text about that in my life. And
then all those things, like he says, it's all very silent.
It is silent, and
the earth crackles. And all that
exactly.
is incredibly evocative.
It's simple, but it's full of incredibly powerful emotions. Mm-hmm. It's an incredible text after which you're never the same anymore. Like after reading the Holocaust memoirs or books that I mentioned before. So he mourned the victims, and he wanted to remember them. Remember and be a witness. He was a witness, and he wrote it down, and now we still can discuss it and feel it. Like after reading his books, I can feel it really, because he was also a poet, I think.
Mm-hmm. And also, supreme journalist. And his book of reportage about the war is a marvelous book.
Well, I think we should probably take some questions from the audience at this point. We have 10 minutes or so, and so...
I would like to know, what do you think? This is a question for all of you. We have different nationalities here. And I know that in some of the countries of, for example, of Eastern Europe, I'm of Czech origin, and in my country of origin, the book was translated, and I don't know, maybe 2,000 copies were sold, and they were sold out, and never ever after that anybody was interested in it. And nobody wants to know anything about the Gulag or about the communist regime in the Czech Republic. I would like to know how it is in Poland. I would like to know what you think, why precisely now and not in the 90s the book is more successful. Thank you.
Well, I don't know, but I was recently in Germany, and I'm writing a second novel about the Holocaust. And I said to my translator lady, I said, I could talk about that, but they don't want to talk about it, surely. And he said, oh no, they do. Yeah. And I thought Germany had done its contrition. That when you get a generation that comes along, and these were younger people, sort of 30-ish, who want to talk about it, then you've done the hard and nauseous work of working your way through past people who don't want to talk about it and past people who like it, like the sort of skinhead movements. And I think we're at that stage now with the Holocaust. We're maybe coincidentally, just as the living witnesses are, coming to the end of their lives, we can see it more clearly. And I think that's perhaps why Grossman is winning an audience now.
Grossman is very popular in Poland and translated from Russian very, very well. So we have Life and Fate and Everything Flows, and they're constantly, in every bookstore. And the same with, I think Poland did a great work with memory. We're talking about the Holocaust differently right now. We're talking about our Jews. So it's a completely different country for the last, after 89. And there are few, I think maybe they're not the subject that we do not discuss, which is wonderful, but we had to wait. My generation wasn't as open as that, and for example, being Jewish in Poland when I was little wasn't so very good and en vogue as it is now.
Well, there's a similar story in Germany that Grossman is becoming very well known as being re-edited very successfully. Life and Fate came out as a re-edition with a new translation, I think in 2006, and has sold very well, followed by collected stories. I think in part it's what Martin has said, that the generation of those who saw the war, who fought in the war, is dying. They, I think, had a hegemony in some sense for a long time over interpreting what this was about, their memoirs, their apologetic accounts, and I think a new generation that's somewhat also more dissociated. It's not the children, it's the grandchildren generation that is now facing this and reading it differently, much more open-mindedly. I think it also helps to pay good translators. The new German edition is a very, very good translation. I think Everything Flows, or Everything Flows is a much better translation than Forever Flowing. That was quite a butchery when it appeared, I think in the early 70s. I looked at that in English, and I saw some real flaws. In fact, I think politically motivated flaws, misreadings of certain concepts. And I think it's right. We're getting out of this dissident Cold War niche, and we're seeing literature.
Yes.
I studied Russian studies in Jerusalem in the early 70s, and so, it's a question of fashion. It's falling between the cracks, because Solzhenitsyn, everybody read everything by Solzhenitsyn, and then all people who were publishing in the early 20s. So he just died in 64, so I think it was questions that, he was in between, so people didn't look at him because we really dealt, we had wonderful Russian studies department and we read was everything important, and we did. It was one of the books on the list, but he didn't really get attention that Bulgakov got and Solzhenitsyn got and the early guys, Babel, Zamyatin. So this is what happened. He fell a little bit between the cracks. So it's time for him to be recognized.
Okay, one last question I think we can do.
Yes, I just finished reading the book, and I was very taken with the development of the characters, how they felt, the denunciation that went around, what you really got the feeling of what it was like to live in a society where it was a fascist society. It was a hardly any freedom, and the people from the different walks of life, he made up the stories for them, but how they reacted to them. And, it kept going back to the absence of freedom, the fact that there was tyranny, the fact that it was one man running this. It sort of is sort of a very frightening idea, because I think it's happening again in other places, where you can't speak up where you're afraid. Well, I certainly recommend that everybody read it, but it was, I say again, he picked the characters and he gave them a setting for how they felt living in this kind of society.
Well, I think one of the reasons why we should read this book and dozens of others like it is that it should be like an air crash investigation. Every time a plane crashes, all the experts converge on that site and find out why that plane went down, and that's not going to happen again. May go down for other reasons that they haven't encountered yet, but you're going to close off that possibility and apply it to the whole fleet of planes throughout the world. And I think that's what all writers about these things are, in a sense, doing, making sure it doesn't happen again.
Well, the other thing that we started talking about was anti-Semitism. I really don't understand what's in the nature of these people. Is it jealousy?
I didn't.
Where does this anti-Semitism, why does it come up so often?
I know. Saul Bellow said, I said to Saul Bellow that anti-Semitism has been described as a neurosis, and he said, no, it's a psychosis. But it's sort of wired in, isn't it? It seems to be, when people have schizophrenia, it'll be, 3 or 4 themes will emerge. The electricity, they'll be talking to light bulbs. Then there'll be a sort of Mick Jagger figure who represents the devil. And then there'll be anti-Semitism. And this is organic mental disease. But it seems to be wired in that the Jews in this ideology, the Jews are marvelously placed, because not only are they, in the shtetls and, filthy, full of disease, as Hitler saying, make the whole society rot around them, but they're also running Wall Street and the Bank of England and the Bourse and Hollywood. So you don't, people who are racially prejudiced against black people never say that they run the world. So it's that dual nature of the Jew that seems to invite this kind of psychosis.
Well, I guess they sort of keep themselves separate, and
there is that. Yeah. No. Yes.
They keep themselves separate, and they are successful.
Well, the ones in Eastern Europe weren't successful. The ones killed by, they were, simple people from the shtetls. They weren't successful. In fact, the writing should have been on the wall for anti-Semitism as an ideology in the Evian conference in 1937, where country after country refused to enlarge their quotas for receiving Jews out of Germany. Now, if the Jews are so powerful, how did that happen?
One last small question, okay.
I know this is frivolous, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Now that Mr. Grossman has come into his own, or we've at last recognized him, can I expect to see a BBC production or a movie?
There was a radio.
Play?
There was a radio program.
I know that's in fact how I discovered him, because reading about the BBC radio reenactment of parts of the novel.
Well, perhaps what we should say is that isn't it very sad that he went to his death, he died thinking that the novel was lost.
Yeah.
Well, there's a 12-part series in Russian television that was very successful that aired last fall. So that should be translated.
There we are. He sold the film rights.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you to the panelists. And